The silence was deafening. 200 Marines stood frozen in perfect formation, their eyes locked on an impossible sight. Their commanding officer, Captain Trevor Blackwood, pinned face down on the training mat by a woman half his size. Staff Sergeant Carmen Morales held him there with surgical precision, her knee pressed against his spine, his arm twisted in a submission hold that had taken less than 30 seconds to execute. The captain's face was pressed against the rubber mat, his earlier smirk replaced by shocked gasps for air. Not one Marine moved. Not one Marine spoke. They had just witnessed the impossible. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But to understand how we got to this moment, we need to go back 3 months earlier to a sweltering Virginia morning at Marine Corps Base Quantico, where Staff Sergeant Carmen Morales was about to discover that proving yourself in the Marines was more complicated than any combat she'd ever faced. The morning sun beat down mercilessly on the advanced combat training facility at Quantico, casting harsh shadows across the sprawling complex where the Marine Corps' elite trained for close-quarters combat. By 0600 hours, the sound of boots on concrete echoed through the corridors as Marines prepared for another day of rigorous training. Among them, moving with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing left to prove, was Staff Sergeant Carmen Morales. At 5'4" and 130 pounds, Carmen didn't look like the typical Marine instructor. Her uniform was regulation perfect, pressed with military precision, but she lacked the intimidating physical presence that most associate with combat training specialists. Her dark hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and her brown eyes held the steady gaze of someone who had seen real combat and lived to tell about it. She carried herself with an economy of movement that spoke of efficiency rather than showmanship. Carmen had arrived at Quantico 6 weeks ago, fresh from a deployment in Afghanistan, where she had served as a combat engineer with the 2nd Marine Expeditionary Unit. Her record was spotless. 3 tours of duty, 2 Bronze Stars, and a reputation for keeping her unit alive in some of the most dangerous territory in Helmand Province. But none of that seemed to matter here at the Advanced Combat Training Facility, where she had been assigned to the Close Quarters Combat Division as an assistant instructor. The problem wasn't her qualifications. The problem was Captain Trevor Blackwood. Blackwood was everything the Marine Corps wanted in a commanding officer, at least on paper. 6'2", 200 pounds of muscle with a square jaw and the kind of commanding presence that filled a room. He had graduated top of his class from the Naval Academy, completed Ranger School, and spent the last 4 years building a reputation as one of Quantico's most effective training officers. His voice carried the authority of absolute certainty, and his men followed him without question. Unfortunately, Captain Blackwood had very specific ideas about who belonged in his division, and Staff Sergeant Carmen Morales wasn't it. Morales, Blackwood's voice cut across the briefing room like a blade. You'll be observing today's hand-to-hand combat training. Take notes on form and technique. Stay out of the way. Carmen stood at attention against the back wall of the briefing room, her notebook pressed against her thigh, watching as Blackwood outlined the day's training objectives to his team of instructors. The other Marines, all men, all significantly larger than her, clustered around the tactical display where Blackwood demonstrated grappling techniques and submission holds. Today we're focusing on combat grappling fundamentals, Blackwood continued, his pointer tracking across diagrams of various holds and throws. These techniques have been proven effective in close-quarters combat situations. We'll be working with the new recruits from Delta Company, 40 Marines who need to understand that size and strength are the primary factors in hand-to-hand combat success. Gunnery Sergeant Ryan Mitchell, Blackwood's second-in-command, raised his hand. Sir, what about incorporating some of the newer adaptive techniques? I've heard there are some innovative approaches being developed. Blackwood's expression hardened slightly. Sergeant Mitchell, we stick to proven methods here. Fancy martial arts moves and creative techniques are fine for movies, but real combat requires real strength and real aggression. That's what wins fights. Carmen made notes, her handwriting steady despite the familiar sting of dismissal. She had developed her own understanding of close-quarters combat during her deployments, techniques that had kept her alive when size and strength weren't an option. But no one had asked for her input. No one ever did. Staff Sergeant Morales, Blackwood's voice carried across the room with the casual authority of someone addressing a piece of equipment. You'll be documenting training effectiveness and injury rates. Stay on the periphery and don't interfere with instruction. The other instructors glanced in her direction with expressions ranging from indifference to mild curiosity. Corporal Alex Santos, one of the younger instructors, gave her a brief nod of acknowledgement. Lieutenant Zoe Williams, the only other woman in the division, caught her eye for a moment with what might have been sympathy. After the briefing, Carmen gathered her materials and headed toward the main training floor. The Advanced Combat Training Facility was impressive. A vast space filled with mats, training equipment, and enough room for multiple simultaneous exercises. Large windows allowed natural light to flood the area, and the smell of rubber mats and cleaning solution hung in the air. Williams approached as Carmen set up her observation station in a corner of the training floor. "Don't take it personally," Williams said quietly, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "Blackwood treats all the new assignments like furniture until they prove themselves." "How long does that usually take?" Carmen asked, adjusting her notebook. "Depends on how you prove yourself. For most of us, it was about demonstrating superior technique during instructor evaluations. For you," Williams paused, "honestly, I'm not sure what it would take. He's got some pretty fixed ideas about combat instruction." Carmen nodded, understanding the subtext. Blackwood's ideas about combat instruction didn't include women, especially not women who looked like they belonged in an office rather than on a battlefield. The morning training session began with 40 fresh recruits from Delta Company filing onto the training floor. They were young, eager, and visibly nervous about their first advanced combat training. Most were straight out of basic training, their movements still carrying the mechanical precision of recent instruction rather than the fluid confidence of experience. Blackwood took center stage, his voice carrying easily across the training floor. "Marines, today you're going to learn the fundamentals of hand-to-hand combat. In real combat situations, you may find yourself without weapons, facing an enemy who wants to kill you with his bare hands. The techniques you learn here could save your life." The recruits stood in neat formations, hanging on every word. Blackwood was an effective instructor, Carmen had to admit. His demonstrations were clear, his explanations precise, and his presence commanded absolute attention. "Combat grappling is about leverage, aggression, and commitment," Blackwood continued, moving to the center mat. "Sergeant Mitchell, join me for a demonstration." Mitchell stepped forward and the two men began demonstrating basic grappling techniques. Blackwood's approach was direct and powerful, using his size advantage to overwhelm his opponent through superior strength and aggressive positioning. The techniques were effective, well executed, and perfectly suited to his physical capabilities. "Notice how I'm using my weight advantage to control the engagement," Blackwood explained as he pinned Mitchell to the mat. "In real combat, you want to press every advantage you have. Size matters. Strength matters. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Carmen watched from her corner, taking notes not just on the techniques being demonstrated, but on the subtle assumptions underlying the instruction. Blackwood's methods were built around the idea that Marines would always have physical advantages over their opponents, that they would be bigger, stronger, and more aggressive than whoever they faced. But Carmen had learned different lessons during her deployments. She had faced opponents who were bigger and stronger, situations where traditional advantages weren't available. She had developed techniques that relied on precision rather than power, timing rather than aggression, and intelligence rather than intimidation. As the morning progressed, she watched the recruits struggle with Blackwood's techniques. The smaller Marines had difficulty executing moves that required significant strength advantages. Several sustained minor injuries trying to force techniques that didn't suit their physical capabilities. The instruction was creating a clear hierarchy. Those with natural size and strength excelled, while others struggled to keep up. "Morales," Blackwood's voice cut across the training floor, "are you getting adequate documentation from your observation post?" "Yes, sir," she replied, though her notes contained observations she suspected he wouldn't want to hear.
"Good. Remember, your job is to document, not to interpret. We have experienced instructors handling the analysis." The dismissal was clear, delivered with the casual cruelty of someone who had never questioned his own assumptions. Around the training floor, a few recruits glanced in her direction, their expressions curious about the staff sergeant who was treated like a clerk rather than an instructor. Carmen returned to her notes, documenting injury rates and technique success percentages with the same precision she had once used to calculate explosive charges. But she was also analyzing patterns, identifying weaknesses in the current instruction methods, and developing solutions that no one wanted to hear. As the session ended and the recruits filed out, exhausted and several sporting minor injuries, Carmen realized that her real challenge at Quantico wasn't going to be proving she could fight. It was going to be proving that there were better ways to teach others how to fight. Lieutenant Williams approached as Carmen packed her materials. "Rough morning for some of the smaller recruits?" Williams observed. "The techniques aren't adapted for different body types," Carmen replied carefully. "There are modifications that could improve effectiveness across the range of physical capabilities." Williams nodded. "Have you shared those observations with Captain Blackwood?" Carmen looked across the training floor where Blackwood was conferring with his senior instructors, their conversation animated and confident. "He hasn't asked for my observations." "Maybe it's time he heard them anyway."
As Carmen left the training facility that afternoon, she carried with her 6 weeks of careful documentation and a growing certainty that the current training methods were leaving Marines unprepared for the realities of modern combat. She had solutions, innovations, and techniques that could save lives. The question was whether anyone would listen to a staff sergeant who didn't fit their image of what a combat instructor should look like. Tomorrow would bring another day of observation, another day of watching preventable mistakes, another day of biting her tongue while Marines learn techniques that might fail them when they needed them most. But Carmen Morales hadn't survived 3 combat deployments by accepting limitations others tried to place on her, and she wasn't about to start now. The barracks at Quantico were never truly quiet, but at 2200 hours, the constant hum of activity died down to whispers and the occasional creak of metal bed frames. Carmen sat at the small desk in her quarters, reviewing the day's training notes under the harsh fluorescent light. Her room was spartanly furnished, regulation, military issue, everything, with only a few personal items to mark it as hers. A photo of her unit from Afghanistan sat beside her laptop, 12 Marines grinning at the camera, unaware that 3 of them wouldn't make it home. She flipped through pages of carefully documented observations, each entry recording not just what happened, but what should have happened. Today's training had resulted in 4 minor injuries and a success rate of roughly 60% for the techniques being taught. In Carmen's experience, 60% wasn't good enough when lives were on the line. A knock at her door interrupted her analysis. She opened it to find Corporal Santos, still wearing his training gear, sweat stains visible on his olive-drab t-shirt. "Staff Sergeant?" he said, glancing down the hallway to ensure they weren't overheard. "Got a minute?" Carmen stepped aside, letting him enter. Santos was one of the younger instructors, maybe 24, with the earnest intensity of someone who took his responsibilities seriously. He'd been friendly enough during her first weeks at Quantico, unlike some of the others who treated her like an unwelcome observer. "What's on your mind, Corporal?" Santos ran a hand through his short-cropped hair. "It's about today's training session. Some of the techniques we're teaching, they're not working for everyone." Carmen set down her pen. "What do you mean?" "The smaller recruits, especially, they're struggling with the grappling fundamentals because they can't generate the leverage Captain Blackwood demonstrates. Private Martinez dislocated his shoulder trying to execute that throw from the morning session. Private Chen couldn't even attempt half the moves because he doesn't have the reach." Carmen had documented both incidents, along with several others. "What did Captain Blackwood say when you raised these concerns?" Santos shifted uncomfortably. "I haven't raised them. Sir, with respect, Captain Blackwood doesn't he doesn't encourage questions about his methods." That was putting it diplomatically. In the 6 weeks Carmen had been at Quantico, she'd never seen Blackwood accept input from his instructors, much less modify his techniques based on feedback.
His training philosophy seemed to be based on the assumption that all Marines should conform to his physical capabilities rather than adapting techniques to match their diverse strengths. "Have you seen alternative techniques that might work better?" Carmen asked carefully. Santos hesitated, then nodded. "Actually, yeah. During my deployment in Iraq, we worked with some British SAS guys who had completely different approaches. Size didn't matter as much with their techniques. They focused on timing, leverage points, using an opponent's momentum against them." Carmen felt a spark of recognition. Joint pressure points and momentum redirection. Exactly. How did you... I learned some similar techniques during my deployments. Had to, actually. When you're 5'4" and operating in areas where the average opponent is 6 inches taller and 50 pounds heavier, traditional grappling doesn't always work. Santos leaned forward, suddenly interested. "Would you be willing to show me some of those techniques? Unofficially, I mean? Just so I can better help the recruits who are struggling?" Carmen considered the request. Sharing alternative techniques with another instructor could be seen as undermining Blackwood's authority. On the other hand, Marines were getting injured trying to execute moves that didn't suit their physical capabilities. "Meet me in Training Room C tomorrow at 1900 hours. Bring workout gear," she said finally. After Santos left, Carmen returned to her notes with renewed focus. She began sketching diagrams alongside her written observations, illustrating modifications that could make the standard techniques more effective for different body types. Joint manipulation techniques that relied on precision rather than strength, throws that used an opponent's weight against them, submission holds that worked regardless of size differentials. These weren't theoretical concepts. Carmen had developed and refined these techniques under combat conditions, where failure meant death rather than just a poor performance evaluation. Every move had been tested in situations where her life depended on their effectiveness. The next morning's briefing followed the same pattern as always. Carmen stood against the back wall while Blackwood outlined the day's training objectives for his all-male team of senior instructors. Today's focus would be defensive techniques, how to escape from various holds and submissions. "Remember," he addressed his team, "the key to defensive grappling is aggressive counterattack. When someone grabs you, you don't try to finesse your way out. You hit them harder than they hit you."
Master Sergeant Ian Brooks, the most senior instructor after Blackwood, raised his hand. "Sir, what about situations where aggressive counterattack isn't viable? Confined spaces, multiple opponents, or when the Marine is significantly outmatched physically?" Blackwood's expression hardened. "Sergeant Brooks, a properly trained Marine is never significantly outmatched. We don't train our people to be victims. We train them to be warriors." Carmen made notes, but her pen pressed harder against the paper than necessary. Blackwood's philosophy sounded inspiring, but it ignored the mathematical realities of physics. A 130-pound Marine would always be at a disadvantage against a 200-pound opponent in a straight strength contest, no matter how much warrior spirit they possessed. "Staff Sergeant Morales," Blackwood's voice carried across the room, "I trust you're documenting these training principles accurately?" "Yes, sir. I'm recording both the techniques demonstrated and their effectiveness rates across different physical categories." Effectiveness rates. Blackwood's tone suggested he found the concept amusing. "Sergeant, these techniques have been proven effective in countless combat situations. The effectiveness rate is 100% when executed with proper commitment and aggression." "Sir, yesterday's training resulted in a 63% success rate during practical application exercises." The room fell silent. The other instructors exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with the challenge to Blackwood's assertion. Carmen realized she had crossed a line by contradicting him with actual data, but the words were already spoken. Blackwood stepped closer to her position against the wall. "Staff Sergeant, are you suggesting that our training methods are inadequate?" "Sir, I'm suggesting that the current techniques could be modified to improve success rates across the full range of Marine physical capabilities." "I see. And you base this assessment on your extensive experience as a combat instructor." The sarcasm was unmistakable.
Around the room, the other instructors watched the exchange with the fascination of witnessing a potential career-ending moment. Carmen felt heat rise in her cheeks, but kept her voice steady. Sir, I based this assessment on 3 combat deployments where these techniques were applied under actual life-or-death conditions. Combat engineering, wasn't it, Sergeant? Explosive ordnance and demolitions. I'm not sure that qualifies you to redesign close-quarters combat training that has been refined over decades by actual fighting specialists. The dismissal stung because it contained just enough truth to be effective. Carmen's official MOS was combat engineer, and her expertise with explosives and demolitions is what had earned her the Bronze Stars. But Blackwood's assessment ignored the reality of modern combat, where engineers often found themselves in direct confrontations with enemy forces. Sir, combat engineers in forward positions frequently engage in close-quarters combat situations. I'm sure they do, but observing combat and designing combat training are very different skills. I suggest you focus on your documentation duties and leave the instruction to those of us with appropriate qualifications. Carmen felt the familiar weight of dismissal settling over her shoulders. In Blackwood's world, her actual combat experience was less valuable than his theoretical knowledge and formal training credentials. The fact that she had used these techniques to stay alive in real combat situations was irrelevant because she didn't fit his image of what a combat expert should look like. Understood, sir.
Good. Now, gentlemen, let's proceed with today's training plan. As the briefing concluded and the instructors filed out to prepare for the morning session, Lieutenant Williams lingered behind. "That was either brave or stupid," she said quietly. "Probably both," Carmen replied, gathering her materials. "For what it's worth, your numbers are right. I've been tracking the same data informally. The current techniques aren't working for about 40% of our recruits." Carmen looked up, surprised. "You've been documenting effectiveness rates too?" "Someone has to. The question is what we do about it." Williams glanced toward the door where Blackwood had disappeared. He's not going to change his methods based on data that contradicts his philosophy. Then maybe it's time to demonstrate alternative methods. Williams raised an eyebrow. Demonstrate how? Carmen thought about her conversation with Santos about the meeting scheduled for that evening in Training Room C. Sometimes the best way to prove a point is to show rather than tell. That evening, Carmen arrived at Training Room C to find not just Santos waiting for her, but 3 other Marines. She recognized them as some of the recruits from Delta Company, the ones who had struggled most with Blackwood's techniques. "Hope you don't mind," Santos said. "Word got around that you might have some alternative approaches." These guys volunteered to help with any demonstrations. Carmen looked at the eager faces of the young Marines. They were the ones who had been labeled as weak or uncommitted because they couldn't execute techniques designed for larger, stronger individuals. They deserved better than a training system that set them up for failure. "All right," she said, setting down her gear. "Let's start with basic principles. In real combat, you rarely get to choose your opponent or the circumstances of engagement. Sometimes you're bigger and stronger. Sometimes you're not. The techniques I'm going to show you work regardless of size differential." For the next 2 hours, Carmen demonstrated and taught techniques that focused on precision, timing, and leverage rather than brute strength. Joint manipulation that could disable larger opponents. Throws that used momentum and balance rather than raw power. Submission holds that worked by understanding human anatomy rather than overpowering resistance. The Marines learned quickly, their success rates dramatically higher than what Carmen had observed during official training sessions. More importantly, they learned with confidence, understanding that their smaller size could be an advantage rather than a liability. "This is incredible," one of the recruits said as he successfully executed a throw against Santos, who outweighed him by 40 pounds. "Where are we learning this stuff in regular training?" Carmen exchanged glances with Santos. Different instructors have different philosophies about combat training. As they wrapped up the session, Santos approached her privately. "Staff Sergeant, this needs to be part of official training. These techniques are game changers." Carmen nodded, but she knew the challenge ahead. Blackwood's authority over the close-quarters combat division was absolute, and he had made his position on alternative techniques very clear. Changing his mind would require more than data or logical arguments.
It would require proof he couldn't dismiss or ignore. Keep practicing these techniques, she told the group as they prepared to leave. Master them. And remember, size is just one factor in combat effectiveness. Intelligence, preparation, and adaptability matter more. As Carmen walked back to her quarters that night, she carried with her the satisfaction of seeing Marines learn techniques that could genuinely save their lives. But she also carried the growing certainty that her unofficial training sessions would eventually come to Blackwood's attention. When that happened, she would need to be ready to defend not just her methods, but her right to teach them. And she suspected that defense would require more than words.
Word traveled fast in a military base, especially when it involves something as intriguing as underground training sessions. Within a week of Carmen's first unofficial lesson, her evening meetings in Training Room C had grown from 4 Marines to 12. They came quietly, separately, using different routes to avoid drawing attention. But in a community as tight-knit as Quantico's advanced combat training facility, secrets had a way of becoming whispers, and whispers had a way of reaching the wrong ears. Carmen arrived early for her 3rd week of evening sessions, carrying a duffel bag filled with training materials she had developed over the years. She had spent hours creating detailed diagrams of leverage points, pressure holds, and momentum-based throws. These weren't techniques she had learned from manuals or formal instruction. They were hard-won knowledge developed through trial and error in situations where mistakes meant death. The training room was already occupied when she entered. Lieutenant Williams sat on one of the benches, still in her duty uniform, looking like she was wrestling with a difficult decision. "Lieutenant," Carmen said, setting down her bag, "I wasn't expecting to see you here." Williams stood, her posture formal, but her expression conflicted. "Staff Sergeant, we need to talk." Carmen felt a cold knot form in her stomach. This was the conversation she had been expecting and dreading in equal measure. "What's on your mind?" "Captain Blackwood asked me to submit a report on unusual activities among the junior Marines. Specifically, he's heard rumors about unauthorized training sessions." The room fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Carmen had known this moment would come, but she had hoped for more time to prove the effectiveness of her methods before facing official scrutiny. "And what did you tell him?" Williams pulled a folder from under her arm. "I told him I would investigate and provide a full report, which brings me to why I'm here." She opened the folder, revealing pages of handwritten notes. "I've been documenting the progress of Marines who've been attending these sessions, performance improvements, injury rates, confidence levels." Carmen tensed, unsure whether Williams was building a case for or against her. "The results are remarkable," Williams continued. "Marines who were struggling with standard techniques are now demonstrating proficiency rates above 80%. Injury rates during practice sessions have dropped to nearly 0. Most significantly, confidence levels and overall performance in official training have improved dramatically." Relief and concern warred in Carmen's chest. "Lieutenant, I appreciate the documentation, but if Captain Blackwood has ordered you to investigate—" "He has, and I'm going to recommend that these techniques be formally evaluated for inclusion in our standard curriculum." Carmen stared at her, surprised by the directness of Williams' statement. In the military hierarchy, junior officers didn't typically recommend changes to their commanding officers' established programs, especially changes that implicitly criticized current methods. "That's a significant risk for you to take," Carmen said carefully. "Maybe, but I took an oath to ensure Marines are prepared for combat. If there are better methods available, I have a duty to advocate for them, regardless of personal consequences." Before Carmen could respond, the training room door opened and Corporal Santos entered, followed by the usual group of Marines seeking alternative instruction. Tonight, however, there were new faces, senior Marines from other units who had heard about the sessions through the informal network that connected all military personnel. "Staff Sergeant," Santos said, noticing Williams's presence, "should we reschedule?" Williams answered before Carmen could speak. "Actually, I'd like to observe tonight's session, if that's acceptable. Consider it part of my investigation." Carmen nodded, understanding that this evening would either legitimize her methods or provide evidence for her dismissal from the program.
All right, everyone. Tonight we're going to focus on escape techniques, how to break free from holds when conventional strength is not an option. She moved to the center of the training mat, her movements economical and precise. The key to understanding escape techniques is recognizing that every hold, no matter how secure it appears, has a weakness. The stronger the hold, the more committed the attacker becomes to maintaining it, which creates opportunities for the defender. Santos volunteered as her demonstration partner, applying a rear chokehold that would be nearly impossible to break through conventional struggling. Carmen allowed him to establish the hold completely, then demonstrated the subtle shift in weight distribution that created the opening she needed. "Notice that I am not trying to overpower the hold," she explained as she executed the escape in slow motion. "I'm finding the point where his grip is weakest and applying pressure in a direction he can't anticipate or counter."
The technique worked flawlessly, and Santos found himself off balance and vulnerable before he realized what had happened. Around the room, the Marines watched with intense concentration, understanding that they were seeing something fundamentally different from their standard training. "The principle applies to any restraint," Carmen continued, moving into variations of the technique. "Wrist grabs, bear hugs, ground pins, they all have weak points that can be exploited with knowledge rather than strength." For the next hour, she guided the Marines through increasingly complex scenarios, each one designed to teach them that intelligence and technique could overcome physical disadvantages. Williams observed from the side, taking detailed notes and occasionally asking questions that demonstrated her own understanding of combat principles. "Staff Sergeant, how did you develop these techniques? They're nothing like what we learn in standard training." Carmen paused, considering how much of her background to share. "I learned them because I had to. During my deployments, I found myself in situations where traditional techniques weren't viable. When you're operating in confined spaces, facing multiple opponents, or dealing with size and strength disadvantages, you adapt or you don't come home." She gestured toward the group of Marines, noting their diverse physical builds. "Look around this room. You represent the full range of Marine capabilities. Different sizes, different strengths, different backgrounds. The idea that one set of techniques can serve everyone equally well ignores the reality of who we actually are." Williams stepped forward. "Can you demonstrate some of the scenarios where these techniques proved most valuable?" Carmen nodded and began describing situations from her deployments: close quarters encounters in narrow corridors, surprise attacks while conducting demolitions work, situations where standard combat training had to be modified for the realities of asymmetrical warfare. With each example, she demonstrated the adaptations that had kept her and her unit alive. "Traditional Marine combat training assumes you'll be fighting other Marines. Similar training, similar capabilities, similar approaches. But modern warfare is rarely that symmetrical. The opponents I faced had different fighting styles, different physical characteristics, different tactical approaches. Adapting to those realities required developing new techniques." As the session concluded, Williams approached Carmen privately while the other Marines dispersed. "I need to ask you something directly," Williams said. "Are you prepared to demonstrate these techniques in front of Captain Blackwood and the senior staff?" Carmen felt her pulse quicken. "That depends on the context. Am I being asked to demonstrate them or challenged to justify them?" "Probably both. Blackwood is aware that something is happening, and he's not the type to let unauthorized activities continue indefinitely. If these techniques are as effective as they appear, they need to be part of official training. But that's going to require convincing people who have significant investment in current methods." Carmen gathered her training materials, understanding the implications of Williams's warning. The evening sessions had been about teaching Marines better ways to protect themselves, but a formal demonstration would be about challenging the entire hierarchy that determined whose voice mattered in military training. "I understand the stakes," Carmen said finally, "but I also understand what happens when Marines aren't properly prepared for the realities they'll face. I've seen good people die because their training didn't match their circumstances." She slung her duffel bag over her shoulder and headed toward the door.
When Captain Blackwood is ready for his demonstration, tell him I'll be ready too. And Lieutenant, make sure he understands that I won't be holding back. As Carmen walked through the quiet corridors of Quantico that night, she knew that her time in the shadows was coming to an end. Williams's report would force Blackwood to either acknowledge the value of her methods or move to shut them down entirely. Given his personality and his investment in current training protocols, Carmen suspected she knew which option he would choose. But she also knew that 12 Marines were now equipped with techniques that could save their lives in combat situations their official training had never prepared them for. Whatever consequences she faced, that knowledge made the risk worthwhile. The question now was whether she could convince 200 Marines and their commanding officers of the same thing.
The morning briefing 3 days later carried an electric tension that every Marine in the room could feel. Captain Blackwood stood at the front with the rigid posture of a man who had made a decision and was prepared to enforce it with absolute authority. Lieutenant Williams sat in the front row, her folder of documentation closed on her lap, her face carefully neutral. Carmen stood in her usual position against the back wall, but today felt different. Today felt like a reckoning. "Gentlemen," Blackwood began, his voice carrying the sharp edge of controlled anger, "it has come to my attention that some of our Marines have been participating in unauthorized training activities that directly contradict the established protocols of this facility." The room fell silent. Carmen could see several of the Marines who had attended her sessions shift uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes carefully focused on the front of the room. Santos sat ramrod straight, his jaw clenched with the tension of keeping secrets under pressure. "These activities," Blackwood continued, "represent not just a violation of proper procedures, but a dangerous undermining of proven training methods that have been refined through decades of combat experience and have saved countless Marine lives." He began pacing in front of the tactical display, his movements sharp and controlled. "I want to be absolutely clear about something. The techniques we teach here are not suggestions or guidelines. They are the result of extensive research, testing, and real-world application. When Marines deviate from these proven methods, they put themselves and their fellow Marines at risk." Carmen felt heat rising in her chest. She had spent 3 weeks watching Marines learn techniques that dramatically improved their combat effectiveness, techniques that had kept her alive through 3 deployments. Now those same techniques were being characterized as dangerous deviations from proven methods. "Lieutenant Williams," Blackwood said, turning toward the front row, "please share your investigation findings with the group." Williams stood, opening her folder with steady hands despite the weight of the moment. "Sir, over the past 3 weeks, I documented the progress of Marines who participated in alternative training sessions. The data shows significant improvement in technique proficiency, reduced injury rates, and increased confidence levels." Blackwood's expression hardened. "Lieutenant, I asked you to investigate unauthorized activities, not to validate them." "Sir, with respect, I investigated as ordered and reported my findings accurately. The alternative techniques demonstrated measurable benefits for Marines who had been struggling with standard training methods." The tension in the room ratcheted even higher. Williams had just directly contradicted her commanding officer's preferred narrative, a career-limiting move that took considerable courage. Around the room, the other instructors watched the exchange with the fascination of witnessing something unprecedented. "I see," Blackwood said, his voice dangerously quiet. "And what exactly were the nature of these alternative techniques that proved so beneficial?" Before Williams could respond, Carmen stepped forward. "Sir, permission to speak." Every head in the room turned toward her. She had broken protocol by speaking without being recognized, but the moment had moved beyond normal procedural boundaries. "Permission denied, Staff Sergeant. You will remain silent while I address the situation." Carmen felt the familiar weight of dismissal, but something had changed inside her during the past 3 weeks. She had watched Marines learn techniques that could save their lives, and she had seen the confidence that came from understanding that their smaller size or different physical capabilities weren't limitations to be overcome, but advantages to be leveraged. "Sir, these Marines deserve to know that there are effective techniques beyond what current training provides." The room erupted in whispers until Blackwood's glare restored silence. "Staff Sergeant Morales, you are out of line. You will report to my office immediately after this briefing for disciplinary action." "Understood, sir. But first,
I'd like to address something you said about proven methods and combat experience. Blackwood's face flushed with anger. Staff Sergeant, I will not tolerate insubordination from someone whose combat experience consists of playing with explosives while real Marines handled the actual fighting. The insult hit like a physical blow, but Carmen had faced worse from actual enemies who were trying to kill her. Sir, during my 3 deployments, I was involved in 47 direct combat engagements. I developed the techniques I've been teaching because the standard methods weren't adequate for the situations I faced. 47 engagements? Blackwood's tone carried disbelief and mockery. Staff Sergeant, combat engineers don't engage in close quarters combat. They blow things up from a safe distance. Carmen felt something snap inside her chest. For 3 weeks, she had documented and endured his dismissal of her expertise. She had watched Marines learn techniques that could save their lives, and she had seen the confidence that came from understanding that their smaller size or different physical capabilities weren't limitations to be overcome, but advantages to be leveraged.
Sir, permission to demonstrate the effectiveness of alternative techniques? Absolutely not. This briefing is concluded. All Marines will return to standard training protocols immediately. Any further unauthorized activities will result in formal disciplinary action. As Blackwood moved toward the door, clearly considering the matter closed, Carmen made the decision that would change everything. Captain Blackwood. He turned, his expression thunderous. Staff Sergeant, you are already facing disciplinary action. I suggest you don't make your situation worse. Sir, you've questioned my combat experience and dismissed my techniques as dangerous deviations. I'm requesting permission to demonstrate their effectiveness in a controlled environment. I've already denied that request. Then I'm challenging the validity of your assessment. The room fell dead silent. Every Marine present understood the magnitude of what had just happened. A staff sergeant had directly challenged a captain's authority in front of the entire instructional staff. In the military hierarchy, this was tantamount to professional suicide. Blackwood stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Staff Sergeant, you have just crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. You are relieved of duty pending formal disciplinary proceedings. Carmen felt the eyes of 40 Marines on her, understanding that her next words would define not just her career but the message sent to every Marine about whether alternative thinking and battlefield experience mattered as much as rank and formal authority. Sir, with respect, relieving me of duty doesn't change the fact that Marines under your command are being taught techniques that don't work for 40% of the personnel attempting to execute them. It doesn't change the fact that injury rates could be reduced if training adapted to the physical realities of our actual Marines rather than theoretical ideal Marines. She stepped closer, her voice carrying the steady confidence of someone who had nothing left to lose. And it doesn't change the fact that I've kept Marines alive in real combat using techniques you've never seen and apparently have no interest in understanding. Blackwood's composure cracked completely. You want to demonstrate your techniques, Staff Sergeant? Fine. Tomorrow morning, 0800 hours, main training floor. You'll have your opportunity to prove that your alternative methods are superior to established Marine Corps doctrine. The challenge hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down in medieval combat. Carmen understood that she had just committed herself to a demonstration that would either validate everything she believed about combat training or end her military career in spectacular failure. Understood, sir. I'll be ready. I hope you are, Staff Sergeant, because I'll be demonstrating the effectiveness of proper technique myself. And when your alternative methods fail against established Marine Corps doctrine, every Marine in this facility will understand why we don't deviate from proven approaches. As Blackwood stormed out of the briefing room, the remaining Marines sat in stunned silence. Carmen had just challenged not just her commanding officer, but the entire system that determined whose expertise mattered in military training. Tomorrow morning, she would either prove that innovation and battlefield experience could triumph over institutional authority, or she would serve as an object lesson about the consequences of challenging established hierarchies. Williams approached as the other Marines filed out, their conversations hushed and urgent. Staff Sergeant, do you understand what you've just committed to? Carmen gathered her materials, her hands steady despite the magnitude of what lay ahead.
Lieutenant, I've understood since I arrived here that I would eventually have to prove my methods work. Tomorrow, I get that opportunity. This isn't just about proving your methods work. Blackwood is going to try to humiliate you in front of 200 Marines. He's going to use every advantage he has, size, strength, formal training, institutional authority, to demonstrate that your techniques are inadequate. Carmen looked around the now empty briefing room, thinking about the Marines who had learned her techniques over the past 3 weeks, Marines who had discovered that their physical limitations weren't insurmountable barriers to combat effectiveness. Lieutenant, tomorrow isn't about me versus Captain Blackwood. It's about whether Marines get trained with techniques that match their actual capabilities and circumstances, or whether we continue pretending that one-size-fits-all approaches work for everyone. She headed toward the door, her mind already beginning to prepare for the most important demonstration of her career. And I've never backed down from a fight that mattered. As Carmen walked through the corridors of Quantico that afternoon, she knew that every Marine she passed had heard about the challenge by now. Military bases were small communities where news traveled fast, especially news as dramatic as a staff sergeant challenging a captain to combat demonstration. Tomorrow morning, 200 Marines would gather to watch her prove that innovation and battlefield experience could triumph over institutional dogma. Or they would watch her fail spectacularly, serving as a cautionary tale about the dangers of challenging established hierarchies. Either way, Carmen Morales was done being invisible.
Dawn came early to Quantico, but Carmen had been awake for hours. She sat on the edge of her narrow military cot, methodically wrapping her hands with the careful precision of someone who understood that the next few hours would define not just her career, but her legacy within the Marine Corps. Outside her window, she could hear the growing buzz of activity as word of the morning's demonstration spread throughout the base. By 0630, Marines from units across Quantico were making their way toward the Advanced Combat Training Facility. What had started as a personnel dispute between a staff sergeant and her captain had evolved into something much larger. A public test of whether innovation and battlefield experience could challenge institutional orthodoxy and win. Carmen finished her hand wraps and stood, moving through a series of stretches and warm-up exercises that had become second nature during her deployments. These weren't the standard Marine Corps calisthenics taught in basic training, but fluid movements designed to prepare her body for the kind of precise, technical combat she would need in the coming demonstration. A soft knock interrupted her preparation. She opened the door to find Lieutenant Williams, accompanied by Corporal Santos and 3 other Marines from her evening training sessions. "Staff Sergeant," Williams said, her voice carrying concern and determination in equal measure, "we wanted to check on you before the demonstration." Carmen stepped aside, allowing the small group to enter her quarters. They looked nervous but resolute, understanding that they were about to witness something unprecedented in their military experience. "How are you feeling?" Santos asked, his young face serious with worry. "Ready," Carmen replied simply. "This demonstration isn't about me proving something to Captain Blackwood. It's about proving something to every Marine who's been told that their size, their gender, or their unconventional background disqualifies them from excellence." Williams pulled out a folder thick with documentation. "I've prepared a complete analysis of training effectiveness, injury rates, and performance improvements from your sessions. Regardless of what happens this morning, there's now an official record of the results you achieved." Carmen took the folder, understanding the significance of Williams's gesture. If the demonstration went badly, this documentation might be the only evidence that her methods had merit. If it went well, it would provide the foundation for potentially changing Marine Corps training protocols. "Lieutenant, I want you to understand something. What happens in there today might end my career, but it won't change the fact that you and these Marines have seen better ways to approach combat training. Don't let institutional resistance prevent you from continuing to seek improvement." One of the younger Marines, Private Chen, stepped forward. "Staff Sergeant, we've all been talking. Those techniques you taught us, they work. We're not the same Marines we were 3 weeks ago. We're stronger, more confident, more capable. That's because you always had the potential. You just needed training methods that matched your actual capabilities instead of some theoretical ideal."
As they prepared to leave for the training facility, Santos lingered behind. "Staff Sergeant, can I ask you something personal?" Carmen nodded. "Are you scared?" She considered the question seriously. "I'm concerned about the implications if I fail, but scared of the demonstration itself? No. I've used these techniques in situations where failure meant death. Today, failure just means proving that institutional bias is stronger than battlefield effectiveness." The main training floor of the Advanced Combat Training Facility had been transformed overnight. The usual scattered equipment had been cleared away, creating a large central area surrounded by tiered seating that could accommodate several hundred Marines. As Carmen arrived at 0745, she was stunned by the crowd that had assembled. Marines from across Quantico filled every available seat, with more standing along the walls and in the doorways. Word of the demonstration had spread far beyond the close-quarter combat division, drawing Marines who were curious about the staff sergeant willing to challenge a captain's authority in such a public forum. Captain Blackwood was already present, standing in the center of the training area in full combat gear. He had changed from his usual duty uniform into training fatigues, his movements carrying the confident aggression of someone who viewed the coming demonstration as an opportunity to decisively prove his superiority. Master Sergeant Brooks approached Carmen as she set down her gear. "Master Sergeant Morales, I want you to understand the parameters of this demonstration. Captain Blackwood has requested that this be conducted as a realistic combat scenario with full contact authorized." Carmen felt a chill of concern. Full contact meant that Blackwood intended to use his significant size and strength advantages without restraint. This wouldn't be a technical demonstration of technique effectiveness. It would be a physical confrontation where her smaller stature would be a severe disadvantage using conventional approaches. "Understood, Master Sergeant. Are there any specific rules or limitations?"
Standard safety protocols apply. No strikes to the eyes, throat, or joints with intent to cause permanent injury. Otherwise, this is a demonstration of combat effectiveness using realistic force levels. As Brooks walked away, Carmen realized that Blackwood had structured the demonstration to maximize his advantages while minimizing her ability to showcase the technical precision that made her techniques effective. In a full contact scenario, size and strength would dominate unless she could demonstrate that intelligence and technique could overcome brute force. Lieutenant Williams appeared beside her. "Staff Sergeant, you don't have to go through with this. The parameters have changed from what was originally discussed." Carmen looked around the packed training facility, seeing the expectant faces of nearly 200 Marines who had come to witness something they had never seen before, a direct challenge to the hierarchy that determined whose expertise mattered in military training. "Lieutenant, every one of these Marines has been told at some point that they need to accept limitations based on their size, their background, or their unconventional approaches to problems. If I back down now, I'm confirming that those limitations are real and insurmountable." She began removing her outer uniform layers, revealing the training gear she wore underneath. "Besides, full contact actually works to my advantage. Captain Blackwood's techniques are designed for controlled demonstration scenarios. Mine were developed in situations where the other person was genuinely trying to kill me." At exactly 800 hours, Master Sergeant Brooks called the demonstration to order. The facility fell silent as nearly 200 Marines focused their attention on the central training area where Carmen and Blackwood faced each other across 10 feet of rubber matting. "This demonstration," Brooks announced, his voice carrying clearly throughout the facility, "will evaluate the effectiveness of alternative combat techniques compared to established Marine Corps doctrine. Both participants have volunteered for full contact engagement under standard safety protocols." Carmen moved to her starting position, her movements economical and precise. She had faced larger, stronger opponents before, but never with such high stakes, and never in front of an audience that included much of her military community. Today wasn't just about proving her techniques worked, it was about proving that Marines who didn't fit conventional molds could excel through intelligence, preparation, and the courage to challenge established assumptions. Blackwood took his position with the confident swagger of someone who had never faced an opponent who refused to be intimidated by size alone. At 6'2" and 200 pounds of muscle, he represented everything the Marine Corps traditionally valued in combat effectiveness. His techniques were proven, his training was extensive, and his authority was absolute. Gentlemen, this demonstration will consist of 3 scenarios. First, defensive techniques, escaping from various holds and restraints. Second, offensive techniques, achieving control and submission of an opponent. Third, realistic combat simulation, full engagement with victory determined by successful submission or incapacitation. As Brooks outlined the parameters, Carmen felt the familiar calm that had always preceded her most dangerous missions. Her mind cleared of everything except the immediate tactical situation, analyzing Blackwood's posture, movement patterns, and the subtle tells that would indicate his preferred approaches. Participants, are you ready? Blackwood nodded curtly, his eyes never leaving Carmen's face. Carmen took a deep breath, thinking about every Marine in the facility who had been told they weren't big enough, strong enough, or conventional enough to excel in military service. Ready, Master Sergeant. Begin demonstration. Scenario 1. Defensive techniques. As Blackwood moved toward her with the confident aggression of someone who had never faced an opponent who refused to be intimidated by size alone, Carmen felt everything she had learned in 3 combat deployments crystallize into perfect clarity. The real demonstration was about to begin.
The first scenario began with Blackwood moving toward Carmen with the methodical confidence of a predator approaching prey he considered already defeated. His approach was textbook Marine Corps doctrine, direct, aggressive, designed to overwhelm through superior size and strength. Carmen stood her ground, her posture relaxed but ready, watching his movement patterns with the analytical precision of someone who had survived by reading opponents correctly. Scenario 1, Master Sergeant Brooks announced to the silent crowd. Defendant will attempt to escape from rear chokehold applied by aggressor using maximum restraint. Blackwood circled behind Carmen, his boots heavy on the rubber matting. The nearly 200 Marines watching held their collective breath as he positioned himself for the hold that would demonstrate, in his mind, the futility of her alternative techniques against proven doctrine. Establish hold, Brooks commanded. Blackwood's arms encircled Carmen's throat from behind, his significant weight and strength advantage immediately apparent. The chokehold was perfectly executed according to standard Marine training, overwhelming force applied with technical precision, designed to incapacitate an opponent through superior physical capabilities. Carmen allowed the hold to establish completely, her body seemingly relaxed within Blackwood's restraint. To the watching Marines, it appeared that the demonstration was about to end before it truly began. Blackwood's confident smile was visible to those seated on the side, his expression carrying the satisfaction of someone whose assumptions were being validated in the most public way possible. Begin escape attempt, Brooks called out. What happened next defied every expectation in the facility. Instead of struggling against Blackwood's superior strength or attempting to break through conventional resistance, Carmen suddenly shifted her weight forward and down, creating a fulcrum point that used Blackwood's own commitment to the hold against him. Her movement was so subtle that many Marines missed it entirely, but the result was immediate and devastating. Blackwood found himself off balance, his weight carried forward by his own aggressive grip. Carmen's right elbow struck backward with surgical precision, not at his body mass where his strength could absorb the impact, but at a specific nerve cluster just below his ribcage that temporarily disrupted his muscular control. The chokehold loosened for a fraction of a second, just long enough for Carmen to execute a movement that looked like liquid flowing upward. She ducked under his weakened left arm while simultaneously grabbing his wrist, using his own momentum to spin him in a direction his body wasn't prepared to resist. In less than 4 seconds, Captain Blackwood found himself face down on the training mat, with Carmen controlling his arm in a submission hold that made any movement painful and resistance impossible. The facility erupted in gasps and murmurs before falling silent again.
What they had just witnessed challenged everything they understood about physical confrontation. Carmen had not overpowered Blackwood. She had made his own strength irrelevant through precise application of leverage, timing, and anatomical knowledge. "Hold established," Brooks announced, his voice carrying surprise despite his professional composure. Scenario 1 complete. Carmen released the hold and stepped back, extending her hand to help Blackwood to his feet. His face was flushed with exertion and confusion, his confident expression replaced by the bewildered look of someone whose fundamental assumptions had just been shattered. "How?" he asked quietly, brushing dust from his training gear. "That chokehold was perfectly applied." "It was," Carmen agreed, "but perfect application of a technique assumes your opponent will respond in predictable ways. When you commit fully to overpowering someone, you create vulnerabilities that can be exploited by someone who understands them." Around the facility, Marines leaned forward in their seats, suddenly understanding that they were witnessing something far more significant than a simple demonstration. They were seeing their entire understanding of combat effectiveness challenged by someone who approached fighting like a science rather than a contest of strength. "Scenario 2, Brooks announced. "Offensive techniques. Defendant will resist aggressor's attempt to establish control using maximum defensive effort." This time, Carmen would be the aggressor, attempting to establish control over an opponent who significantly outweighed her and possessed superior formal training. Blackwood positioned himself defensively, his stance now more cautious after the unexpected outcome of the first scenario. "Begin engagement." Carmen approached with the same fluid economy of movement she had displayed during the escape, but now the watching Marines could see the predatory intelligence in her positioning. She didn't move toward Blackwood's center mass, where his strength advantages would be most effective. Instead, she circled to his left, forcing him to turn and adjust his stance repeatedly. "She's making him work," Lieutenant Williams whispered to Corporal Santos, who was watching with wide-eyed fascination. "He's bigger and stronger, but she's controlling the distance and timing of the engagement."
Blackwood threw a powerful right-handed strike, the kind of aggressive move that had overwhelmed countless opponents during his years of training and instruction. Carmen wasn't there when the strike arrived. She had read his body language, recognized the telegraph of his intended attack, and moved to a position where his power couldn't reach her. But more than simply avoiding the strike, she had positioned herself to take advantage of his commitment to the attack. As his momentum carried him forward, she applied pressure to specific points on his extended arm. Not strikes, but precisely targeted touches that disrupted his balance and muscular control. Blackwood found himself stumbling forward, his own strength working against him as Carmen guided his movement in directions his body wasn't prepared to resist. Before he could recover his balance, she was behind him, her smaller frame somehow controlling his larger body through positioning that made his size irrelevant. The submission hold she applied was unlike anything in standard Marine training. Instead of trying to overpower his neck or torso, she controlled his arm and shoulder in a way that made any resistance painful and any escape impossible. The leverage was perfect, the execution flawless, and the result undeniable. "Hold established," Brooks announced, his voice now carrying genuine amazement. "Scenario 2 complete." As Carmen released the hold and helped Blackwood to his feet again, the facility remained silent except for the sound of nearly 200 Marines processing what they had just witnessed. Their commanding officer, a man whose physical superiority and technical expertise had never been questioned, had been systematically outfought by someone half his size, using techniques none of them had ever seen. Blackwood's face had gone through several expressions during the second scenario: frustration, confusion, and now something that might have been respect. "Those techniques," he said, his voice carrying none of its earlier certainty. "Where did you learn them?" "I developed them, sir. 3 deployments, 47 direct engagements, situations where the person trying to kill me was bigger, stronger, and better armed than I was. These techniques kept me alive when conventional approaches weren't options." She looked around the facility at the faces of Marines who were seeing their understanding of combat effectiveness fundamentally challenged. The techniques work because they're based on physics and anatomy, rather than assumptions about who's stronger or more aggressive. They work regardless of size, gender, or conventional physical advantages, because they use an opponent's strength against them rather than trying to match it.
Master Sergeant Brooks stepped forward for the final scenario announcement, but his voice carried a different tone now, the sound of someone who was witnessing something that would change how he thought about combat training. Scenario 3, he called out, full engagement simulation. Victory by submission or incapacitation. No time limits. This was the moment Carmen had been preparing for since she first arrived at Quantico, not just proving that her techniques worked in controlled demonstrations, but proving that battlefield innovation could triumph over institutional orthodoxy in direct, unrestricted confrontation. Blackwood took his position for the final scenario, but his posture had changed. The casual confidence was gone, replaced by the wary respect of someone who had learned that his assumptions about combat effectiveness were dangerously incomplete. Carmen moved to her starting position, feeling the weight of nearly 200 pairs of eyes, and understanding that the next few minutes would determine not just her own future, but the message sent to every Marine about whether innovation, intelligence, and unconventional approaches could triumph over established doctrine. Participants ready? Both Marines nodded. Begin final engagement. The silence in the facility was absolute as Captain Trevor Blackwood and Staff Sergeant Carmen Morales faced each other in the kind of unrestricted combat that would settle, once and for all, whose approach to fighting was truly superior.
For the first 10 seconds, neither combatant moved. They circled each other slowly, both having learned from the previous scenarios that assumptions about this fight would be dangerous. Blackwood's earlier confidence had been replaced by careful calculation. He had just experienced firsthand that his opponent possessed capabilities that defied conventional understanding of combat dynamics. Carmen moved with the fluid patience of someone who understood that the opening moments of unrestricted combat were about gathering information rather than delivering decisive attacks. She watched Blackwood's stance, his breathing, the subtle shifts in weight that would telegraph his intentions. 3 deployments had taught her that surviving combat was less about overwhelming opponents and more about reading them correctly. The watching Marines held their collective breath as the 2 fighters continued their careful circling. This wasn't the explosive, aggressive engagement they had expected. Instead, it resembled a chess match played at combat speed, each participant analyzing their opponent's capabilities while concealing their own intentions. Blackwood struck first. His attack was everything Marine Corps doctrine emphasized: direct, powerful, designed to end the engagement quickly through superior aggression. He launched himself forward with the kind of overwhelming assault that had dominated every previous opponent he had faced in training scenarios. But Carmen wasn't a training scenario. She read his attack pattern 2 seconds before he committed to it, recognizing the subtle preparation in his stance that indicated an incoming right-handed strike followed by a grappling attempt. Instead of positioning herself to block or counter the attack, she simply moved to where his strike couldn't reach her. Blackwood's powerful swing met empty air as Carmen flowed to his left side, her movement so precisely timed that she seemed to disappear from his attack path. But more than simply avoiding his strike, she was already positioning herself for a counter that would use his momentum against him. As his missed attack carried him forward off balance, Carmen applied what she had privately labeled cascade pressure, a series of precise contacts to specific points on his body that disrupted his muscular control and balance in sequence. Her right hand touched a nerve cluster below his extended arm, causing temporary weakness in his grip strength. Her left elbow made contact with a pressure point on his back, disrupting his core stability. The combination of contacts lasted less than half a second, but the effect was immediate and devastating. Blackwood found himself stumbling forward, his body no longer responding with its usual coordination and strength. Carmen was already moving to her next position as Blackwood tried to recover his balance. She had analyzed dozens of combat encounters during her deployments, understanding that the key to defeating larger opponents was creating cascade failures, disrupting multiple systems simultaneously so that size and strength advantages became irrelevant. Blackwood attempted to spin toward her, recognizing that he needed to re-establish distance and reset the engagement. But Carmen had anticipated this response.
As he turned, she was already behind him, her smaller frame somehow controlling his movement through positioning that made his superior weight work against him. What happened next was the culmination of everything Carmen had learned about combat during her 3 deployments. Instead of attempting a traditional takedown that would rely on overpowering Blackwood's resistance, she applied pressure to 3 specific points simultaneously: his wrist, his shoulder, and a balance point at the base of his skull. The combination created what she called neurological confusion. His brain received conflicting signals about his body's position and movement, making coordinated resistance impossible. Blackwood tried to counter. His training and instincts demanded that he use his size advantage to overwhelm her control. But every movement he made was anticipated and countered by Carmen's precise application of leverage and anatomical knowledge. His strength became a liability as she guided his momentum in directions his body wasn't prepared to resist. The takedown was unlike anything the watching Marines had ever witnessed. Carmen didn't overpower Blackwood or execute a dramatic throw. Instead, she simply made his body's natural balance and coordination systems work against him until gravity became her ally. Captain Trevor Blackwood, 6'2" and 200 pounds of muscle, found himself being guided to the ground by a woman half his size, who seemed to understand exactly how his body would respond to every pressure and movement. But the takedown was only the beginning. As Blackwood hit the mat, Carmen was already transitioning to a control position that combined elements of traditional wrestling with joint manipulation techniques she had developed during close-quarters combat in Afghanistan. Her positioning was perfect. She controlled his center of gravity while maintaining leverage over his primary limbs. Blackwood struggled against the hold, his training demanding that he use his superior strength to break free. But Carmen's technique was designed specifically to neutralize strength advantages. Every movement he made was anticipated and countered, his resistance redirected into positions that made escape impossible while avoiding injury.
Impossible, someone whispered from the crowd, their voice barely audible in the silent facility. But everyone could see that it wasn't impossible. It was happening before their eyes. Carmen applied the final element of her control technique, a pin that combined pressure point manipulation with leverage mechanics. Her knee pressed against a specific point on Blackwood's spine that made any movement painful without causing actual injury. Her hands controlled his arms through wrist and elbow positioning that prevented him from generating the leverage needed for escape attempts. Captain Trevor Blackwood was completely immobilized by a staff sergeant who weighed 60 pounds less than he did. The facility fell into the kind of absolute silence that occurs when 200 people simultaneously witness something that challenges their fundamental understanding of reality. Not a single Marine moved. Not a single voice spoke. Even breathing seemed muted as they processed what they were seeing. Carmen held the pin for 10 seconds, ensuring that every Marine in the facility understood that this wasn't a lucky accident or a momentary advantage. This was complete technical domination achieved through superior understanding of combat principles rather than superior physical capabilities. "Yield?" she asked quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the silent space. Blackwood's face was pressed against the rubber mat, his earlier confidence replaced by the shocked realization that everything he thought he understood about combat effectiveness had just been proven incomplete. He had been outfought not by someone stronger or more aggressive, but by someone who understood fighting at a level he hadn't known existed. "I yield," he said, his voice muffled but audible throughout the facility. Carmen immediately released the hold and stepped back, extending her hand to help him to his feet. The gesture was respectful, professional, carrying no hint of gloating or triumph. She had proven her point not to humiliate Blackwood, but to demonstrate that Marines deserved access to the most effective combat techniques available, regardless of who developed them or whether they fit conventional expectations. As Blackwood rose from the mat, brushing dust from his training gear, the facility remained locked in absolute silence. 200 Marines had just watched their commanding officer, a man whose authority and expertise had never been questioned, systematically outfought by techniques that challenged every assumption they held about combat effectiveness. The silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds, a duration that felt like hours in the charged atmosphere of the training facility. Carmen stood quietly beside Blackwood, understanding that the real demonstration had been completed, but knowing that the most important part was still to come. What she said next would determine whether this had been simply a dramatic upset or the beginning of fundamental changes in how Marines were prepared for combat. But first, she allowed the silence to speak for itself. 200 Marines were processing the fact that innovation, intelligence, and unconventional approaches could triumph over established doctrine when applied with sufficient skill and understanding. The era of dismissing alternative techniques as dangerous deviations had just ended with the sound of absolute silence.
Master Sergeant Brooks was the first to break the silence that had enveloped the facility. His voice carried the careful neutrality of a senior NCO who had just witnessed something that would require extensive documentation and explanation to higher command. "Demonstration complete," he announced, though his words seemed inadequate to describe what had actually occurred. All three scenarios concluded with successful technique demonstration by Staff Sergeant Morales. The clinical summary barely captured the magnitude of what the Marines had witnessed, but it served to break the spell of shocked silence that had held the facility in its grip. Gradually, conversations began to emerge from the crowd, whispered discussions, urgent questions, and the kind of animated analysis that follows any event that challenges fundamental assumptions. Carmen remained standing beside Blackwood, her posture respectful but confident. She had proven her point decisively, but she understood that demonstration without explanation would leave too many questions unanswered. The watching Marines deserved to understand not just what they had seen, but how and why it had worked. "Staff Sergeant Morales," Master Sergeant Brooks said, his voice carrying new respect, "would you be willing to explain the techniques you demonstrated for the benefit of the assembled Marines?" Carmen nodded, understanding that this moment was as important as the demonstration itself. She moved to the center of the training area where everyone could see and hear her clearly. "What you just witnessed," she began, her voice carrying easily throughout the facility, represents the application of combat principles that prioritize intelligence over strength, precision over aggression, and adaptation over rigid doctrine. She gestured toward Blackwood, who remained standing nearby with an expression that combined confusion, respect, and professional curiosity. Captain Blackwood executed every technique perfectly according to established Marine Corps doctrine. His form was flawless, his commitment was total, and his physical capabilities are exceptional. The techniques I used didn't work because his approach was wrong. They worked because they were designed to counter exactly his type of approach. Around the facility, Marines leaned forward to catch every word. Many of them had struggled with the same size and strength disadvantages that Carmen had just overcome so decisively. "During my 3 deployments, I encountered opponents who possessed every advantage Captain Blackwood demonstrated today: superior size, strength, training, and often better equipment. Traditional Marine Corps doctrine assumes that our Marines will have physical and technological superiority over their opponents. But modern warfare doesn't always provide those advantages." She moved to the training mat where the demonstration had taken place. Her movements still carried the fluid precision that had characterized her fighting. "What I demonstrated are based on 3 fundamental principles that differ from conventional combat doctrine. First, instead of trying to match an opponent's strength, you make their strength work against them. Second, instead of attacking where they're strongest, you target the points where their strength becomes a vulnerability. Third, instead of committing to predetermined techniques, you adapt continuously based on how they respond." Lieutenant Williams stood up from her seat in the front row. "Staff Sergeant, can you demonstrate how those principles apply to specific techniques?" Carmen nodded and gestured for a volunteer from the crowd. Corporal Santos immediately stepped forward, understanding that he was about to become part of a lesson that would be remembered by every Marine present. "Corporal Santos will demonstrate a standard chokehold approach," Carmen announced. "Notice his technique. It's exactly what we teach in standard training. Powerful, direct, designed to overwhelm through superior positioning and strength."
Santos moved behind Carmen and applied the same rear chokehold that Blackwood had used in the first scenario. His technique was technically perfect, following Marine Corps doctrine precisely. Now watch what happens when I apply Principle 1, making his strength work against him, Carmen said calmly, even while secured in Santos's hold. She executed the same movement she had used against Blackwood, but this time in slow motion so the Marines could analyze each component. Her forward movement, the creation of a fulcrum point, the precise elbow strike to disrupt Santos's muscular control, and the spin that used his grip strength to off-balance him. Notice that I'm not trying to break free through strength. I'm using his commitment to the hold to create the leverage I need for escape and counterattack. Santos found himself controlled in the same submission hold that had dominated Blackwood, but now he could understand the mechanics of what had happened. The principle applies to any technique, Carmen continued, releasing the hold and helping Santos to his feet. Every attack creates vulnerabilities in the attacker. Every strength becomes a weakness when properly exploited. Every rigid doctrine becomes predictable when faced with adaptive thinking.
She looked around the facility at the faces of Marines who were beginning to understand that they had been witnessing something far more significant than a simple upset victory. The second principle, targeting vulnerability points instead of strength points, is based on anatomical and biomechanical knowledge rather than assumption about who's tougher. Carmen gestured toward her own smaller frame. I will never be as strong as Captain Blackwood. I will never be as large as most of the opponents I face in combat. But I understand exactly where the human body is vulnerable, regardless of size and strength, and I've learned to target those vulnerabilities with precision rather than power. Captain Blackwood, who had been listening with intense concentration, stepped forward. Staff Sergeant, those pressure points you targeted, where did you learn to identify them with such accuracy? Combat necessity, sir. When conventional techniques aren't viable, you learn to understand anatomy at a level that most training doesn't require. Every human body has the same vulnerability points, the same leverage mechanics, the same neurological responses to specific types of pressure. She moved to demonstrate on Santos again, this time showing the precise locations of the nerve clusters and pressure points she had targeted during the demonstration. These aren't mystical martial arts concepts, she explained. They're applied anatomy and physics. When you understand how the human nervous system responds to specific stimuli, you can create temporary disruptions in muscular control and balance that make size advantages irrelevant. The facility had grown completely quiet again as Marines absorbed the implications of what Carmen was teaching. This wasn't just about fighting techniques, it was about approaching problems with intelligence and innovation, rather than relying solely on traditional advantages. The third principle, adaptive thinking instead of rigid doctrine, is perhaps the most important, Carmen continued. Every opponent responds differently. Every situation presents different challenges. The techniques that work against one person in one circumstance may be completely ineffective against a different person in a different circumstance. She looked directly at Blackwood as she spoke. Captain Blackwood's techniques are proven and effective against opponents who respond predictably to strength and aggression. But when faced with an opponent who understands those techniques and has developed specific counters, rigid adherence to doctrine becomes a liability. Master Sergeant Brooks stepped forward, his expression thoughtful. Staff Sergeant, are you suggesting that current Marine Corps combat training is inadequate? Carmen chose her words carefully, understanding that her answer would be remembered and repeated throughout the Marine Corps hierarchy. Master Sergeant, I'm suggesting that current training is incomplete. The techniques we teach are excellent for the scenarios they were designed to address, but modern combat presents scenarios that require additional capabilities that can be developed through understanding principles rather than memorizing techniques. She gestured toward the crowd of Marines who had been watching with intense fascination. Every Marine in this facility has different physical capabilities, different strengths, different challenges. One-size-fits-all training assumes that all Marines can and should fight the same way, but adaptive training that teaches principles allows each Marine to develop techniques that match their individual capabilities while achieving the same combat objectives. Lieutenant Williams stood again. Staff Sergeant, how do we implement these principles in standard training? Carmen smiled, understanding that the question represented exactly the kind of institutional curiosity that could lead to meaningful change. We start by acknowledging that innovation and adaptation are Marine Corps values, not deviations from Marine Corps values. We start by recognizing that battlefield effectiveness matters more than conformity to traditional approaches. And we start by teaching Marines to think like problem solvers rather than technique executors. As Carmen concluded her explanation, the facility erupted in questions, discussions, and the kind of animated conversation that follows any presentation of ideas that challenge established assumptions. But beneath the excitement, there was something more significant. The recognition that they had just witnessed the beginning of a fundamental change in how Marines would think about combat preparation. Captain Blackwood approached Carmen as the crowd began to disperse, his expression carrying new respect and professional curiosity. "Captain Blackwood," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology, and I'd like to request a private meeting to discuss how these techniques might be integrated into our training program." Carmen extended her hand, understanding that institutional change often began with individual recognition of better approaches. "Captain, I'd be honored to share everything I've learned. These techniques belong to the Marine Corps, not to me." As they shook hands, 200 Marines dispersed throughout Quantico, carrying with them the understanding that innovation, intelligence, and unconventional thinking could triumph over established doctrine when applied with sufficient skill and courage. The era of dismissing alternative approaches had ended. The era of adaptive excellence had begun.
3 weeks after the demonstration that had left 200 Marines silent, the Advanced Combat Training Facility at Quantico looked fundamentally different. Where once rigid adherence to standard doctrine had dominated every training session, now Marines could be seen experimenting with adaptive techniques, discussing alternative approaches, and questioning assumptions that had previously been accepted without analysis. Carmen walked through the main training floor at 0630, no longer relegated to the back corner with her clipboard and observer status. Her position had been officially redesigned as Senior Combat Innovation Specialist, a role that combined traditional instruction with development of adaptive training protocols. The change represented more than just a title modification. It signified institutional recognition that innovation and battlefield experience were valuable assets rather than threats to established order. "Staff Sergeant Morales?" called Private Chen, one of the Marines who had struggled most with traditional techniques before attending Carmen's unofficial sessions. "Could you review the cascade pressure application we practiced yesterday?" Carmen approached the small group of Marines who had gathered around one of the training mats. They represented the full spectrum of Marine physical capabilities, different sizes, different backgrounds, different strengths, and challenges. Under the old training system, several of them had been labeled as weak or unsuited for close-quarters combat. Under Carmen's adaptive approach, each had discovered techniques that matched their individual capabilities while achieving superior combat effectiveness. "Remember," Carmen said, watching as Chen practiced the nerve disruption technique on his partner, "cascade pressure isn't about hitting harder. It's about understanding exactly where to apply minimal force for maximum effect. Your opponent's nervous system doesn't care how much you weigh. It only cares about precision and timing." Chen executed the technique perfectly, causing his larger training partner to lose muscular control and balance through precisely applied pressure rather than overwhelming force. 6 weeks earlier, Chen had been nearly dropped from the combat training program due to his inability to execute standard grappling techniques against larger opponents. "Outstanding," Carmen said, making notes on her training assessment sheet.
You're achieving the same tactical objectives as traditional techniques, but using methods that match your actual capabilities rather than forcing you to conform to someone else's physical advantages. Lieutenant Williams approached, carrying a folder thick with documentation. Her role had evolved as well. She now served as liaison between Carmen's innovation program and the formal Marine Corps training hierarchy, ensuring that new techniques were properly documented and integrated into official curricula. Staff Sergeant, Williams said, I have the effectiveness reports from the past 3 weeks. The results are remarkable. Carmen accepted the folder, scanning through pages of data that demonstrated the success of adaptive training approaches. Injury rates had decreased by 42%. Technique success rates had improved across all physical categories of Marines. Most significantly, confidence levels and overall combat readiness scores had reached the highest levels ever recorded at the facility. Lieutenant, what's the response from higher command? Williams smiled. Colonel Morrison is arriving this afternoon for a formal evaluation of the program. Word has reached Marine Corps headquarters about the techniques you've developed. There's serious discussion about implementing adaptive training protocols at bases throughout the Corps. The implications were staggering. Carmen had begun her time at Quantico as a dismissed observer, whose expertise was considered irrelevant to combat instruction. Now, her methods were being evaluated for Corps-wide implementation, potentially affecting how thousands of Marines would be prepared for combat situations. And Captain Blackwood's position on the program? See for yourself, Williams said, gesturing toward the main instruction area. Carmen looked across the training floor to see Captain Blackwood working with a group of senior instructors, demonstrating adaptive modifications to standard techniques. His approach had transformed completely since the demonstration 3 weeks earlier, where once he insisted on rigid adherence to established doctrine, he now encouraged experimentation and innovation within sound tactical principles. Gentlemen, Blackwood was saying to his instructors, remember that our mission is to prepare Marines for combat effectiveness, not to preserve training methods for their own sake. If Staff Sergeant Morales' techniques achieve better results, then our duty is to learn those techniques and integrate them into our instruction. Master Sergeant Brooks, who had overseen the original demonstration, raised his hand. Sir, some of the traditional instructors are expressing concern about abandoning proven methods for experimental approaches. Blackwood's response demonstrated how completely his perspective had evolved. Sergeant Brooks, 3 weeks ago, I would have agreed with those concerns. But now I've seen Marines achieve combat capabilities I didn't think were possible using techniques that prioritize intelligence over strength. Our obligation is to results, not to tradition. Carmen felt a surge of satisfaction hearing Blackwood articulate the principles she had been trying to communicate since arriving at Quantico. The transformation in his approach represented exactly the kind of institutional evolution that could save Marines' lives in real combat situations.
Staff Sergeant Morales, Blackwood called out, noticing her presence on the training floor. Could you join us for a moment? Carmen approached the group of senior instructors, understanding that her relationship with the facility's leadership had undergone a complete reversal. Where once she had been excluded from tactical discussions, she was now sought out for her expertise and innovation. Sir? We're developing modified training protocols for next month's advanced combat course. I'd like your input on adaptive techniques that could be integrated with standard doctrine to improve overall effectiveness. The request represented institutional recognition that Carmen's expertise was valuable and necessary for optimal Marine training. More importantly, it demonstrated that innovation and adaptation were being embraced as Marine Corps values rather than viewed as threats to established authority. Captain, I'd recommend focusing on principle-based instruction rather than technique-based instruction, Carmen said. When Marines understand the underlying principles of leverage, pressure points, and momentum redirection, they can adapt those principles to match their individual capabilities and the specific circumstances they face. Corporal Santos, who had become one of Carmen's most effective assistant instructors, stepped forward. Sir, we've seen remarkable results when Marines are taught to analyze their opponents and adapt their approach based on what they observe, rather than executing predetermined techniques regardless of circumstances. Blackwood nodded thoughtfully. Can you provide specific examples of how that approach improves combat outcomes? Carmen gestured toward the Marines training throughout the facility. Sir, look around this floor. 3 weeks ago, approximately 40% of these Marines were struggling with standard techniques because those techniques didn't match their physical capabilities. Today, those same Marines are achieving success rates above 80% because they're using adaptive approaches that leverage their actual strengths rather than forcing them to compensate for perceived weaknesses. She pointed toward Private Chen, who was now successfully demonstrating control techniques against opponents significantly larger than himself. Private Chen was nearly dropped from combat training under the old system. Today, he's one of our most effective students because he's learned to use precision and intelligence rather than trying to match opponents through strength he doesn't possess. Williams added her own observations. Captain, the confidence transformation has been as significant as the technical improvement. Marines who previously felt inadequate due to size or strength limitations now understand that combat effectiveness comes from understanding principles rather than possessing specific physical advantages. Blackwood studied the training activity throughout the facility, his expression thoughtful. Staff Sergeant, I have a question that goes beyond technical instruction. How do we balance innovation with the need for standardized training that works across the entire Marine Corps? Carmen had been expecting this question since the program had begun expanding beyond Quantico. Sir, the key is teaching adaptable principles rather than rigid techniques. When Marines understand leverage mechanics, pressure point anatomy, and momentum redirection, they can apply those principles consistently regardless of their individual physical characteristics or the specific opponents they face. She moved to one of the training mats to demonstrate her point. Watch this. Corporal Santos and Private Chen are going to demonstrate the same tactical objective, achieving control of an opponent, using techniques adapted to their different physical capabilities. Santos, larger and stronger, demonstrated a technique that utilized his size advantage while incorporating the precision elements Carmen had taught. Chen demonstrated a completely different approach that achieved the same tactical result through leverage and pressure point application rather than strength. Same principle, same objective, different execution based on individual capabilities, Carmen explained. That's how we standardize effectiveness while maintaining adaptability. Blackwood watched the demonstrations with intense interest. Outstanding! That approach maintains tactical consistency while allowing for individual adaptation. It's exactly what we need for Corps-wide implementation. As the morning training session concluded, Carmen realized that her role at Quantico had evolved far beyond anything she had imagined when she first arrived as a dismissed observer. She was now helping to shape how the Marine Corps approached combat training at the most fundamental level. But more importantly, she was proving every day that innovation, intelligence, and unconventional thinking were Marine Corps values, not threats to Marine Corps tradition. Every Marine who learned her techniques represented a life potentially saved in future combat, a warrior better prepared for the realities of modern warfare. The transformation was complete. The observer had become the teacher, the dismissed had become the essential, and the alternative had become the standard. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to improve Marine combat preparation, and new chances to prove that the best traditions are built not on a rigid adherence to past methods, but on relentless pursuit of better ways to accomplish essential missions. Carmen Morales was no longer fighting for recognition. She was fighting for the future of Marine Corps excellence.
6 months later, Carmen stood at the podium of the Marine Corps Combat Development Command in Quantico, addressing an audience that would have been unthinkable during her early days as a dismissed observer. The auditorium was filled with senior officers from across the Marine Corps, combat instructors from every major base, and representatives from allied military forces who had come to observe the revolutionary training methods that were transforming how Marines prepared for combat. The presentation screen behind her displayed data that told the story of institutional transformation. Injury rates reduced by 57% across all participating bases, combat readiness scores at historic highs, and most significantly, feedback from deployed Marines indicating that adaptive training techniques were saving lives in real combat situations. 6 months ago, Carmen began, her voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had proven that innovation could triumph over institutional resistance. Many of us believed that combat effectiveness was determined primarily by physical advantages: size, strength, aggression. Today, we understand that the most powerful weapon any Marine possesses is adaptive intelligence. In the front row, Colonel Morrison sat beside Captain Blackwood, both men representing the kind of leadership evolution that had made the Corps-wide transformation possible. Morrison had championed Carmen's methods at the highest levels of Marine Command, while Blackwood had become one of the most effective advocates for adaptive training among field instructors. The techniques we've developed aren't revolutionary because they're new. They're revolutionary because they're based on recognizing and leveraging the diverse capabilities that already exist within our Marine Corps. Every Marine brings different strengths to combat situations. Our training now adapts to those strengths, rather than forcing conformity to arbitrary physical standards. Lieutenant Williams, now promoted to captain and serving as Director of Adaptive Training Implementation, sat in the second row taking notes that would guide the expansion of Carmen's methods to international allied forces. The techniques that had begun in secret evening sessions in Training Room C were now being studied by military professionals from 12 different countries. "Can you provide specific examples of combat applications?" asked Brigadier General Patricia Hayes, the commanding officer of Marine Corps Training and Education Command. Her presence at the briefing indicated the highest-level institutional support for Carmen's innovations. "Can you provide specific examples of combat applications?" asked Brigadier General Patricia Hayes, the commanding officer of Marine Corps Training and Education Command. Her presence at the briefing indicated the highest-level institutional support for Carmen's innovations. Carmen clicked to the next slide displaying after-action reports for Marines deployed in various combat zones. "General, we've received feedback from operational units indicating that adaptive techniques have been successfully applied in confined space engagements, situations involving significant size disparities between Marines and opponents, and circumstances where traditional approaches weren't viable due to equipment limitations or terrain constraints." She highlighted specific cases where Marines had used her techniques to survive encounters that might have been fatal under traditional training approaches. Most significantly, we're seeing improved confidence and decision-making in complex combat situations. Marines who understand adaptive principles are better equipped to analyze rapidly changing circumstances and respond effectively, rather than relying solely on predetermined responses. The data was compelling, but Carmen understood that the real transformation went beyond statistics. She had received dozens of letters from Marines who credited adaptive training with saving their lives or the lives of their fellow Marines. Each letter represented validation that her decision to challenge institutional orthodoxy had achieved its ultimate objective, better preparing Marines for the realities of modern combat. "Staff Sergeant Morales," General Hayes said, using Carmen's recent promotion in rank, "what are your recommendations for expanding these techniques beyond the Marine Corps?" The question addressed the most significant development in Carmen's program: interest from other military branches and allied forces in adopting adaptive training methods. The Army, Navy, and Air Force had all sent representatives to observe her techniques, while NATO allies were requesting formal training exchanges. "General, the principles we've developed are universally applicable because they're based on human anatomy and physics rather than service-specific doctrine. Any military force that faces opponents with diverse capabilities and unpredictable tactics can benefit from training that emphasizes adaptability over conformity." She advanced to her final slide, showing a map indicating bases where adaptive training was being implemented worldwide. "We're currently working with 12 allied nations to integrate these methods into their combat preparation programs. The feedback has been consistently positive, with particular success in preparing forces for asymmetric warfare scenarios." Master Sergeant Brooks, now serving as Senior Enlisted Advisor for the Adaptive Training Program, stood to add his perspective. "General, one of the most significant benefits we've observed is improved unit cohesion. When Marines understand that different approaches can achieve the same tactical objectives, they're more likely to support teammates whose capabilities differ from their own."
The comment highlighted an unexpected but crucial benefit of Carmen's approach. By teaching Marines that combat effectiveness came in many forms, the training had reduced the informal hierarchies that had previously privileged certain physical types over others. As the formal briefing concluded, Carmen reflected on the journey from her first morning at Quantico, when she had been dismissed as an irrelevant observer. That version of herself could never have imagined standing before senior Marine Corps leadership as a recognized expert whose methods were reshaping how the Corps prepared for combat.
But more importantly, she had proven that the values she fought for, innovation, adaptability, recognition of diverse strengths, were not challenges to Marine Corps tradition, but fulfillments of the Corps' deepest commitments to excellence and effectiveness. Captain Blackwood approached as the audience dispersed, his transformation from a skeptical authority figure to collaborative partner, representing the kind of institutional evolution that made lasting change possible. "Staff Sergeant," he said, extending his hand, "I wanted to thank you for teaching me that true leadership means being willing to learn from anyone who can make Marines more effective." Carmen shook his hand, understanding that their relationship now represented the best of military professionalism, senior and subordinate working together toward shared objectives, regardless of rank or conventional authority structures. "Captain, you demonstrated something equally important, that institutional strength comes from leaders who prioritize effectiveness over ego." As they walked together through the corridors of the Combat Development Command, Carmen noticed the photographs lining the walls. Images of Marines throughout Corps history who had embodied the values of innovation, courage, and excellence under pressure. Her own photograph would soon join that gallery, not because she had sought recognition, but because she had proven that those values required constant renewal through willingness to challenge assumptions and seek better approaches. "What's next for the program?" Blackwood asked. Carmen smiled, thinking about the dozens of Marines she was now training as adaptive combat instructors, each of whom would carry these methods to new units and new challenges. "Captain, we're just getting started. Every Marine who learns these techniques becomes capable of teaching others. Every unit that implements adaptive training becomes more effective, and every success proves that innovation and tradition can strengthen each other rather than compete." They paused at a window overlooking the training facilities where hundreds of Marines were learning to approach combat as problem solvers rather than technique executors. The site represented everything Carmen had worked to achieve. Marines prepared for the realities of modern warfare through training that recognized their diverse capabilities and encouraged adaptive thinking. "You know," Blackwood said thoughtfully, "when I first met you, I thought your alternative approaches were threats to proven methods. Now I understand that they were exactly what those proven methods needed to remain relevant." Carmen nodded, understanding that institutional evolution required exactly this kind of recognition, that preservation of essential values sometimes required fundamental changes in methods and approaches. As evening fell over Quantico, Carmen walked to her quarters carrying with her the satisfaction of having transformed not just her own career, but the trajectory of Marine Corps combat training. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to improve military effectiveness, and new chances to prove that the best traditions grow stronger when combined with innovative thinking. The dismissed observer had become a recognized leader. The alternative techniques had become standard doctrine. The voice that hadn't mattered had become essential to Marine Corps excellence. But most importantly, hundreds of Marines were now better prepared to survive and succeed in combat because one staff sergeant had refused to accept that her expertise was irrelevant, her methods were dangerous, or her voice didn't matter. Sometimes the most important battles are fought not against external enemies, but against internal assumptions that limit potential and dismiss innovation. Carmen Morales had won that battle, and in doing so, had opened new possibilities for every Marine who would follow in her footsteps. The legacy was written not in regulations or official doctrine, but in the improved capabilities of Marines who now understood that excellence comes not from conforming to predetermined standards, but from adaptive application of sound principles to diverse challenges and circumstances. That understanding would serve the Marine Corps well in all the battles yet to come. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.